Welcome to Aviation News Talk. Coming up on today's program, the FAA has a new forecast for general aviation, but it's not all good. And a Cessna crossed the border into Canada, crashed, but then the pilot couldn't be found. And what Harrison Ford said when he phoned the tower after landing on a taxiway. Plus, this emergency in the news.
Mayday, I just lost my engine.
All right, is that 2 Alpha Mike?
2 Alpha Mike, I lost them both.
Okay, 2 Alpha Mike, there's an airport off your left wing in about 10 miles. There's one off your right wing in about 15 miles. Greensboro West, 230, emergency. I got this guy out here, 22 Alpha Mike, on a squawk code of 2153, just lost his engines. Point me to the nearest airport that I can get him in. He has no gyros, nothing.
Plus more general aviation news stories, and we answer a question from a listener about how to fly a GPS approach to LP minimums. All this and more, and the news starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. So last week, NATCA, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, honored controllers at their 13th annual Archie League Medal of Safety Awards banquet in Las Vegas. The awards are named for Archie League, who was the first air traffic controller here in the United States. Just to let you know how much things have changed, back in 1929, he was hired by the St. Louis, Missouri airfield, and every day Archie had to drag his control tower out onto the airfield. The control tower consisted of a wheelbarrow onto which he'd mounted an umbrella for shade, plus he had his lunch, a notepad, and a pair of signal flags that he used to direct air traffic. Well, there were many Archie Awards presented last week, but since our program focuses on GA, I want to highlight one of the awards involving a Piper S-Tec. According to an NTSB report on March 27, 2016, the aircraft departed Charleston, South Carolina for Baltimore. The pilot stated that the flight departed with 5 hours of fuel for the estimated 2.5-hour flight. But about an hour into the flight, the pilot reported to air traffic control that he had lost his directional gyro and attitude indicator. While diverting to the Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport, the right engine abruptly lost power. After switching fuel tanks, power was briefly restored to the right engine, but that was then followed by an abrupt loss of power to both engines. Richard Wallace and Jamie Steinberg were on duty at Washington Center when this call came in.
Mayday, I just lost my engine.
All right, is that 2 Alpha Mike?
2 Alpha Mike, I lost them both.
Okay, 2 Alpha Mike, there's an airport off your left wing in about 10 miles. There's one off your right wing in about 15 miles. Greensboro West, 230, emergency. I got this guy out here, 22 Alpha Mike, on a squawk code of 2153, just lost his engines. Point me to the nearest airport that I can get him in. He has no gyros, nothing.
Okay, closest airport, Martinville, is on a about a 270 heading and 16 miles with their IFR.
Okay.
We got somebody that just landed. They're going to call us with a pirate.
Okay, all right. 22 Alpha Mike is an airport off your left wing and 15 miles. They are IFR, though.
I'm going to need a road or something. I don't have any engine.
And 22 Alpha Mike, there should be a highway, I'm thinking off your left side, should be Highway 77 or 81 right there in that vicinity. I'm pulling that section chart now to find it. There's a road there down 58 Alpha Mike. I don't have any displays on this map for the highways.
All right, we'll just see what we can find when we get out of the loop.
Okay, well, the minimum vectoring altitude in that area is 3,100 feet. There are a lot of terrain and mountains there. And there's a Route 58 that goes to Danville. You probably should be pretty close there. He runs east-westbound, maybe a mile or two off your left or right side. Greensboro 230.
Greensboro West.
Hey, listen, that guy's coming down. Is there a highway or something that you can point me towards right there?
Greensboro 392. Show me a highway anything out there.
You guys don't have any idea about the terrain up there?
Hold on. We don't have anything depicted.
All right, W. November 21 Victor Alpha Center.
Go ahead.
You familiar with this area west of Danville? Is there an airport or not an airport, but a road somewhere this guy's trying to put it down anywhere on the highway?
I'm not familiar with here, but I'll look and see if I can find anything.
I think he's already down below 1,000. 22 Alpha Mike, you doing okay down there? And 22 Mike, Alpha Mike, how do you hear the center? You all right? Southwest 2741, contact center on 1875.
Hey, center, AC 5392, level 16000.
AC 5392, roger. If you ever cross him, be a 12, do me a favor.
We can do that via 12, and what you got?
I just had a guy lost his engine about west of Danville right now. See if you can transmit for 22 Alpha Mike and see if he can hear you by chance.
Okay, this frequency or guard?
On this frequency.
22 Alpha Mike, this is AC 5392 for 22 Alpha Mike. Can you hear me? No response from Alpha Mike.
Okay, thanks. 21 Victor Alpha, you want to do me a favor, please?
Yes, sir.
Well, I want to take you over the place where I lost radar with him. Can you fly there for me?
South Boston, Greensboro. Yeah, that aircraft that lost its engines, the last observed position for us was about 095 heading off of Martinsville at about 18 miles.
21 Victor Alpha.
21 Victor Alpha.
See if you can transmit on this frequency if a 22 Alpha Mike hears you.
22 Alpha Mike, I'll try him. 1 Victor Alpha. Aircraft 22 Alpha Mike, this is velocity, November 21 Victor Alpha, do you copy? 22 Alpha Mike, velocity 21 Victor Alpha, over. The center, no response from 22 Alpha Mike 1.
Okay, thanks. May have crashed. We're waiting here. He thinks he heard that the guy landed there. Board's up to date. Altimeter is usable. We're in the Sioux. IFR everywhere. Nobody in or out except from this guy right here. Tried raising him a couple times with some different airplanes and no joy. Tried to send via new business over here. So we're just waiting to hear something here.
Well, you can just hear the concern in the controller's voice, and it gets a little bit more somber in tone. So the good news is the pilot landed on the median of a highway about 14 miles from Danville, Virginia. He hit a tree and the aircraft came to rest upside down. Now, the pilot had some minor injuries, but all 3 passengers, which included 2 children, were uninjured. We have links in the show notes where you can see the list of all of the 2017 Archie League winners, plus there's a link to the live YouTube broadcast of the award show. You can also see a picture of Archie League, taken about 80 years ago as he's sitting in his chair next to his wheelbarrow control tower. Our congratulations to all of this year's winners, and thanks for the great job that air traffic controllers perform for us every day. Speaking of the FAA, our next story comes from the Wichita Eagle newspaper with the headline, FAA forecasts decline of 17,500 piston airplanes. And they go on to say the FAA's 20-year forecast expects the GA fleet to increase from about 209,000 airplanes and helicopters in 2016 to about 213,000 in 2037. Now, that's a pretty weak 0.1% annual increase. During that period, turbine aircraft, including both business jets and turboprops, are expected to grow at an annual rate of about 2% per year, and helicopter annual growth will be about 1.6%. But the piston airplane fleet is expected to shrink 0.8% annually. And so the FAA says over that 20-year period, the total number will decline by over 17,000 aircraft. Now, the FAA uses inputs from its 2014 General Aviation and Part 135 Activities Survey, plus other sources and discussions with industry experts to come up with this forecast. Now, I know I got one of those surveys in the mail a couple of years ago, and hopefully you fill yours out if you ever get one in the mail as well, too. Now, one of the odder general aviation stories last week came from Canada, and unfortunately, it's a sad one as well. As reported in the Daily Mail and also the Detroit Free Press, an aircraft crashed in Canada. When authorities arrived, there was nobody in the cockpit and no footprints around the aircraft. Police now believe that a pilot from Michigan jumped out of the aircraft into midair and an apparent act of suicide before the aircraft continued on using the autopilot and crashed when it was out of fuel in Canada. The pilot, who was 27 years old, is described as an experienced pilot who was also a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. He is reported to have rented the Cessna 172 at the Ann Arbor Airport earlier in the day. Diane Brown, a spokeswoman for the university's Division of Public Safety and Security, said university police have reasons to believe his actions likely were an act of self-harm. The pilot, who was from China and had graduated from the university in Beijing in 2011, was studying artificial intelligence and ironically had hoped to work one day in aviation safety. According to the university's website, it says he was studying computer-human interaction, artificial intelligence, and natural language processing. In talking about himself on the website, he said that he had been a software engineer intern at Google for 2 summers and wrote that I'm a very enthusiastic about general aviation and currently affiliated with the Michigan Flyers, which is a club at the University of Michigan. I love taking friends up for sightseeing flights. I've flown a number of Detroit River tours, San Francisco Bay tours, and Puget Sound tours. So a very sad story, and our condolences go out to the pilot and to his family. From aeronews.net comes this story that the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, otherwise known as the Atlanta Airport, is using drones for runway inspection. So that's quite a bit of a turnabout where in the past the FAA has tried to keep drones away from airports. In this case, they have granted a waiver to the airport and a surveying contractor to allow drones to be flown in the restricted airspace of the airport. The aircraft will be used to make alternate surveys of the areas of the airport that are slated for changes as part of a $6 billion construction project, which is now under the way. It's the second time a waiver has been granted allowing drones to fly at the airport. In January, they were used to capture imagery and data where parking garages are slated for construction. I don't know about you, but I do own a couple of drones, but given the choice, yeah, I like flying the big ones a little better. And from avweb.com comes a story that Boom Technology has raised additional capital to support their supersonic demonstrator. Boom Technology wants to build the next supersonic airliner, the first since the Concorde, and they've raised $33 million to fund development of a 1/3 scale demonstration aircraft they call the XB-1. According to the SEC, the company has raised $41.9 million. Their CEO and founder, Blake Scholl, says, "Our mission is to make supersonic flight a reality," and he expects the XB-1 to be close to ready to fly in the next year. If successful, he says the XB-1 will be the first independently developed and privately funded supersonic jet. Well, it's quite likely they are hoping to reduce the noise signature sufficiently to permit transcontinental flight, which would certainly broaden the market for supersonic flight. The article doesn't mention that there is another company looking to do something similar. I believe the company name is Aviation, and they're located in Reno, and they have been working on a supersonic business jet as well. From EAA, the Experimental Aircraft Association, first there were IMC clubs and now the VMC club. If you're not familiar with the IMC club, these have been around for a couple of years, and basically they are opportunities for EAA members and other interested people to meet in local chapter meetings to discuss real-world flying scenarios that an instrument pilot might encounter. I haven't been to one of these meetings, but a friend of mine went to one last week and talked in great detail about how they discussed what an instrument pilot might do if his aircraft lost radio communication while 7,000 feet over JFK and picking up ice. So they came up with a lot of different creative solutions. Anyway, this announcement now says that there's something similar available for VFR pilots. The VMC club is modeled after the IMC clubs, and it will do the same for pilots who are not instrument rated but fly primarily under visual flight rules. The club offers monthly meetings in which pilots can network and share knowledge and experience. The meetings use real-world scenarios to engage members and allow a free exchange of information that improves awareness and skills. It says all EAA members are automatically eligible to take part in the VMC and IMC club programs in their local chapters, and you can find out more information about that at EAA.org. Well, Harrison Ford is back in the news, and probably not in the way he would like to be. You probably recall a couple weeks ago, we talked about this on the other podcast that I'm involved with, the Airplane Geeks podcast that you can find at airplanegeeks.com. And we talked about how Harrison Ford, who was cleared to land on a runway at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, accidentally landed on a taxiway instead. Now we have, courtesy of TMZ, the phone call that Harrison Ford made when he called the tower, and he has some choice words about himself.
Showing Tower, James Causey.
Yeah, hi, it's Husky 89er Hotel uniform and the schmuck that landed on the taxi.
Hi, James Causey. Just a couple of quick things. One, I was
distracted by the, I'm sorry, go ahead. Distracted by the airliner, which was in movement when I turned to the runway, and also the big turbulence from the landing Airbus on the parallel.
Okay.
Runway.
All right. So, just a couple of things. So, possible pilot deviation because you were cleared to land on the left, and you landed.
Totally understand.
Right.
Totally understand.
Right. So, I just need to get some stuff. I got to fill out some paperwork, and it'll go to FSDO. So, can I just get your name and your pilot's license?
The name is Harrison Ford.
Okay.
on my pilot's license. It's in my backpack.
Okay. Take your time. No big deal.
Yeah. Oh, it's a big deal for me. Hold on.
Oh.
There's then about 45 seconds of mostly wind noise and perhaps some breathing as Harrison Ford is digging his pilot certificate out of his backpack, and we've cut that portion out before the conversation resumes.
I've got a temporary airman.
It's okay. That'll work.
Because I lost it, but I'm looking for it.
It's okay. Take your time.
Okay, my certificate number is...
And just a good phone number that you want FSDO to call you on in case they have to talk to you.
Yes, sir.
And I know that, and I know this number will not go anywhere else but to them.
I'll try to give it to everybody else.
Sir, I will pass that information on to them, and somebody from their office will get in contact with you. Okay?
No doubt. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Furt. Have a great day. No worries. Bye.
Bye.
Well, at the beginning of that, Harrison Ford said that he was the schmuck that landed on the taxiway. I heartily disagree. I think that he was contrite. He fessed up, owned up to what he had done, and I think that he'll be treated fairly by the FAA. Of course, that's not the advice that an aviation attorney would give you. They would probably tell you not to admit to anything. But let's just talk briefly about what's likely to happen in a situation like that. Once that gets referred to the FSDO, they open up a file, and they'll take a look at the pilot's past history, and then they will probably phone the pilot to try and learn more about the circumstances, pull the tapes, any radar plots. And then ultimately they've got about 4 different options. They could do nothing, which is pretty unlikely. They could give a warning, which I think is probably pretty likely. They could require remedial training, which again, quite likely. Or they could basically suspend the license for 30 days or something like that. I think that's highly unlikely. So anyway, our best wishes to Harrison Ford. That's the news for this week. Next, some pilot tips. In a few minutes, we'll get to that listener question about flying GPS approaches to LP minimums. But first, I wanted to talk about fuel. It's on my mind for 2 particular reasons. We just heard that ATC recording of a Piper S-Tec going into Virginia. Both engines quit at the same time. So we don't know the cause of that accident, but anytime both engines quit at the same time, you'd have to suspect that fuel is one possibility. The other reason is that I had a flight earlier this week with a client who just started flying with, and he did something regarding fuel that really surprised me. So I want to share that with you. So let's first talk about how do you know how much fuel you have before you leave? Well, it really pays to have information from more than one source. The absolute best source, of course, is going to be visually inspecting the tanks. If it's a Cessna, climb all the way up there, open the cap, and look in. If you don't do that, you really don't know for sure how much fuel you have. And if you're using a dipstick, make sure that you stick it straight down. You don't put it in at an angle, as that might overestimate the amount of fuel that you have in the tank. You could also look at the fuel gauges, but hopefully you know that the fuel gauges are only required to be accurate at one point, and that is when they read 0, which is not very helpful. So we never want to trust fuel gauges. Now, another source of information could be how many gallons were just added to the aircraft. So if the aircraft was refueled in your presence, take a note of how many gallons they put into the aircraft. Or if it's a rental aircraft and it's, the tanks haven't been topped, you can look and see how long did somebody fly in the previous flight. And that might be just kind of a relative indication that might confirm, what you believe the amount of the tanks are. I would never rely on that as the sole source of information, but maybe it would confirm what you already believe. So here's what happened. The gentleman started the aircraft. It's a Garmin G1000 equipped aircraft. So at one point, you enter into the fuel totalizer the number of gallons that you have on board. And that would be the same as if you had, a JPI fuel totalizer or some other instrument that totalizes the amount of fuel burned in flight. And so he set it for the tabs, which is 64 gallons. And as he was doing that, I said, oh, did you check how much fuel we had? And we said yes, and I kind of left it at that. And then I looked at the fuel gauges, and I thought, they look just a little lower than that to me, but, I'll just keep an eye on them, which I did. We flew about, 45 minutes to another airport, and we're doing landing practice there. And I kept eyeballing the fuel gauges and thought, they still look a little lower than I would expect. So I asked him again, but this time I said, how did you check how much fuel we had in the aircraft? And he said, I looked at the fuel gauges. I thought, that is not a very reliable indicator of how much fuel we have on board. So we went ahead and stopped at that airport, fueled the aircraft, at which point, we were then able to focus on other things. I don't know if you've had this experience, but anytime I've been low on fuel, I have found that about 50% of the time I'm now thinking about the fact that I'm possibly low on fuel. Once you have enough fuel, wow, suddenly that frees up your brain to be thinking about other things that you should be focusing on. So let's talk about some ways that you might not have as much gas as you think you do. In the Cessnas, there is a fuel valve with a both position, and most times people fly with it in the both position all the time. However, during fill-ups, you really ought to turn that to either the left position or the right position before the aircraft is filled. And the reason is that if it's in the both position, the fuel line, which connects the two tanks, is open. And as the fuel person is filling one tank, that fuel is going to be slowly draining from the tank he's filling to the other tank. And then the same thing happens as they go to the other tank. So it's unlikely you're going to get a full load of fuel if in your Cessna, the fuel valve is in the both position. I mentioned the problem with dipsticks. I ran into another issue with a student about a year ago in a Cirrus, and we typically would fly those with the fuel at the tabs. And as we were getting ready to go, I said, did you check the fuel? And he said, yes, it's at the tabs. I looked at the fuel gauges, and again, they looked lower than I thought that they would be, so I decided I would just keep an eye on them. And I knew that we were flying to an airport only 19 miles away, and my thought was, if there's any issue, then we'll know about it soon enough to get on the ground. So we took off, and probably 5 minutes into flight, the low fuel annunciator came on. Now, in the SR-20s, what that means is that you have somewhere between 8.5 and 17 gallons because there's a sensor in each tank, and both of those sensors have to go below 8.5 gallons in order to get the annunciator to show up in the aircraft. So, for example, you could have one tank completely empty, and that annunciator would still not turn on as long as you had more than 8.5 gallons in the other tank. So I was sure that we had enough fuel to continue on, another 5, 7, 8 minutes to get to our destination. And that's when I discovered that when he looked into the fuel tank, he noticed that the tab was wet. And he assumed that since the tab was wet, that meant that the fuel was all the way up to the tab, which of course it wasn't. It was way, way, way below the tab. So what I've resolved to do in aircraft like that, where I'm looking down at a tab, kind of like a little, curved finger, bent out there, I just go ahead and wiggle the wing of the aircraft. By doing that, it jostles the fuel around enough that you can actually see, is the fuel above the tab, below the tab. So anytime you have an ambiguous type, situation like that, just rock the wing, and that'll help you see if the fuel is really above the tab or not. So other things, I would say be wary of flights that are longer than the ones that you typically do. I can think of two situations where somebody made the same flight over and over and over again, but on the fatal flight in one case, they started from a slightly further away position, ended up being low on fuel. In one case, they actually made it, but they landed with about 2 or 3 gallons. That's a particularly interesting one because that was also a G1000 equipped aircraft. And you would think that the fuel totalizer would give you an accurate indication once you set it. In this case, the computer misled him, which is kind of ironic because he was a software guy. What happens with the fuel range ring in the G1000 is that it puts a ring around your aircraft, estimating how far you can fly until you run out of fuel. That's based on how much fuel you set is in the aircraft, which is what you enter at the very beginning into the totalizer, based on your current ground speed, and based on your current fuel flow. So if you're running at full throttle, that range ring is going to shrink in. If you're running at very low throttle, it's going to expand. This gentleman was flying from Idaho down to Palo Alto, California. He's done the trip many times, but this time he started from an airport, I think about 50 miles further away. As he was approaching Livermore, which is 19 miles away from Palo Alto, he decided he was going to land because the fuel range ring was getting small, and he thought, boy, I really should get some fuel. As he reduced the throttle to land at Livermore, what happened? Well, the ring expanded because he was now using a lower fuel flow rate because he had just reduced the throttle. And he said, aha, it looks like I now have enough fuel to make it all the way to Palo Alto. Very, very, very foolish. He continued on. He did land with 2 or 3 gallons. And of course, the club was aware of that because when the fueler filled the aircraft, he noticed it took far more fuel than it should have, and it alerted the club. When they asked him, he said, well, I'm a computer scientist and I trust what the computer told me. So, yeah, not a rocket scientist, apparently. So just be wary that you can't totally rely on indications that come out of the computer. You have to understand what the data is that's driving those indications. Other problems that you can have, for example, faulty fuel gauges. You could have a plugged fuel vent, for example. So if the fuel vent were plugged, then eventually as fuel comes out of the tank and goes into the engine, there wouldn't be a way for air to go back into the tank to replace the fuel that's been burned, and that's going to start to create a vacuum, which eventually will stop fuel flow from the tank. Other things, I'm familiar with a case in which a Cirrus lost its gas cap in flight, and when that happens, the low-pressure air over the top of the wing essentially just vacuums the fuel directly out of the tank. And so that's a pretty serious situation as well. You could get a blocked fuel filter. That would prevent fuel flow. You could get ice in your fuel lines. And interestingly, I looked up on S-Tec. They had a change made to their fuel tank system. All of their bladders, the fuel tank bladders, are vented individually, which actually makes them a little bit superior to the Apaches, which preceded them, which didn't have that. And the Apaches were particularly susceptible to ice in the fuel lines because you weren't able to fully drain all the water out of those particular tanks. Another problem that could cause fuel starvation, vapor lock. So I've seen this in turbocharged aircraft, especially if the aircraft has been sitting on the ground, the fuel is really hot because it was heating up in the wings on a hot day. As you climb to altitude, the fuel can start to vaporize a little bit in the fuel lines, and you'll see EGTs, your exhaust gas temperatures, start to rise. And in the extreme, you could have fuel starvation, too much vapor in the lines preventing the engines from continuing to run. Lastly, you could also have a failed fuel pump. Fuel pump fails, and fuel is not going to make it to the engine. Now, here are some other problems. Sometimes people will run a tank dry, and then when they go to switch to the other tank, the aircraft doesn't start immediately. If you like to run your tanks dry, my advice, do it at altitude. You don't want to do it when you're low in the pattern. Frankly, my preferred method of switching fuel tanks is to switch while I'm still at altitude before I get so low to the ground, like, for example, traffic pattern altitude, where if I were to run a tank dry, I might not have time to get the aircraft to start if it didn't start immediately. So consider getting on your fullest tank long before you get down to the traffic pattern altitude. And another thing that can lead to fuel starvation, if, for example, you forget to lean, you're going to burn a lot more fuel than you had planned to, and that's going to be a problem. You're going to come up short at your destination. So Cessna, with the Cessna 172 SPs, which they introduced back in 1997, added a low-fuel annunciator light. And I saw them claim a couple years ago, I hope it's still true, that they had not had a single fuel-related incident since those low-fuel annunciator lights were added. Now, on the 172, my recollection is that that will go off anytime you're below 5 gallons in either tank. So there's a low fuel indicator for both the left and for the right tanks. And so as soon as either tank goes below 5 gallons, you'll get that annunciator. I think the Cessna 182 does the same thing at 8 gallons. And finally, let's turn to our listener question. If you have a question regarding general aviation you'd like to answered, you can leave a message on our voicemail at 650-967-2500. That's a voicemail-only line. And if you would leave your name and phone number in case I need to get back to you to clarify your question. This question came in via Facebook. I'm not going to give the gentleman's full name because, well, you'll see in a minute he did inadvertently bust minimums on an instrument approach. He says, "Hey, it's John so-and-so. Yesterday, I ran into the perfect storm of sorts, and I've been trying to figure out the answer. I think I know the answer, but wanted to check with the expert." Well, thanks for that, John. He says, "I now fly a Turbo Commander." He mentions the equipment in it, a Garmin 950, S-Tec Autopilot. And he says, "I was landing at Hailey, Idaho, which is Sun Valley. And wouldn't you know it, the weather was getting bad. I was in a hold at Menin, picking up ice and watching my fuel." He says, "Hailey has a new approach, the RNAV GPS X Runway 31, and it's an LP approach. Okay, on final, I hit APR on my S-Tec, and yes, it captured the glide slope. I put GS in parentheses because it's a non-precision approach, so technically there is no glide slope, but yes, the S-Tec can capture it. Okay, here's the rub," he says. "I'm descending down, and sure enough, the autopilot takes me below the 6180 MSL, which is the MDA for this approach. And yes, it's snowing, and full disclosure, I can't see the runway environment, but it does pop into view about 6,000 feet MSL, or roughly 750 feet above the ground. My bad, my fault," he says. Well, when the ramp crew met me, they said, "Well, John, we all lost the bet. We knew you were in the holdover Menin as conditions were getting bad, and we did not think you would get in." He says, "I did not feel good about my decision. Here's the mistake I think I made. I should not have hit the APR button on the S-Tec. It captured the GPS glide slope when in truth there is none on an LP approach. And it lulled me into thinking I was safely on a glide slope. Is that correct? In other words, I turned a non-precision approach into a precision approach when it does not exist. I should not hit the APR button." He says, second question, "Could I have hit the Alt button when I noticed that I descended slightly below the MDA, and would that have stopped my descent?" Finally, he says, "I got home, researched LP approaches, and looked at both the JEP charts for this approach and the government charts. Interestingly, the JEP chart shows a dotted line of what I will call glide slope guidance, and it shows a dotted line below the MDA. The government chart does not. I'm not looking for excuses, but it seems to me the JEP chart, in this case, almost encourages you to get on the glide slope rather than dive and drive. Max, any light you can share on this for me will be greatly appreciated. I've flown into Sun Valley literally hundreds of times. I'd taken off from Caldwell, New Jersey, stopped in Minnesota to refuel, where I had gusting winds of up to 45 knots, and we had 140-knot headwinds over Lake Michigan a few hours before. Got to Sun Valley, had 2 loops in the hold, and then was cleared right when the weather was descending. Just lousy timing. Yes, I was the last plane that got in." Well, John, we're really happy that this worked out as well as it did, and you did figure out most of the issues that were going on here. So in my reply to John, I mentioned to him that, yes, I started my instrument rating in Caldwell, New Jersey before I moved here to California. I lived in New Jersey about 7 years, and that airport, Essex County, is where John had departed from. And I asked him if I could use the answer in our new podcast here, and he said, sure, you could go ahead and share it with the listeners. So yes, he definitely fell into a WAAS trap that I've talked about with others, but I've never actually seen anywhere in print. And let's just take one step back, and I'll give a brief explanation. If you have a WAAS-capable GPS, the most common minimums that a GA pilot would fly to would be LP+V, which is similar to an ILS. It's got a localizer, and it's got an approach course, which is a funnel. So in other words, it gets more narrow as you get closer to the runway. And the other alternative usually would be an LNAV approach. There you don't have any vertical guidance. It's a non-precision approach, and it's going to be flying essentially into a rectangle. It's plus and minus 0.3 miles wide all the way up to the runway. So it does not get more narrow as you get closer to the runway. A few years ago, Garmin added the advisory glide slope to LNAV approaches, and that does give a glide slope of sorts that you can follow. And the autopilots treat them just as they would a normal glide slope for a precision approach. And that's the issue that John ran into. Well, later on, the LP approaches were introduced. An LP approach is a non-precision approach that you can think of as being similar to a localizer approach, but for GPS. So like a localizer, it's got an angular course. It gets more narrow as you get closer to the runway. However, it's a non-precision approach, and so there's no official glide slope. But Garmin did give the advisory glide slope to some of these LP approaches. So in fact, when you come into an when you come into an LP approach, it looks for all intents and purposes like an LP+V approach if there's a +V on that LP. The difference is with an LP+V approach, you're allowed to descend through the minimums as you make your decision about whether to land or go around. With a non-precision approach like an LP approach or an LP+V approach, you have a hard floor, an MDA, through which you're not allowed to descend as you make your decision. And so John got into the trap, which was he went ahead and used the approach key, which coupled to the glide slope, the +V of this LP+V approach, and that's perfectly fine. However, when he got to minimums, the autopilot treated it like a precision approach, and it went right through the MDA instead of leveling off. So the solution, as John correctly figured out, is you have to monitor your altitude, and when you're at the MDA, you want to push the Alt key so that the autopilot goes into altitude hold mode at that point. So it's a little bit more manual effort than you would find with other types of approaches, but it's an important distinction that's really important to remember because you're not allowed to descend through that to MDA until you have the runway in sight. And this is probably a good time to mention that you can learn all there is to know about GPS and WAAS approaches if you're an instrument pilot by getting a copy of my Max Trescott's GPS and WAAS Instrument Flying Handbook. It covers really step-by-step detailed instructions for common GPSs like the Garmin 430, 530, 480, the G1000, the Bendix KLN 94, and even the Garmin 480. And so just don't get stuck in the clouds wondering which button you need to push. Go ahead and call 800-247-6553. The book is $39.95. And of course, you can contact me anytime for any questions you might have. Well, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Aviation News Talk. You can find our show notes at our website at aviationnewstalk.com. Or if you're listening to the iPhone podcast app, just touch the cover artwork at the top of your display, and you can see the show notes and the contact information there. Remember, if you have any questions for us that we can answer on the show, just leave a message at 650-967-2500. So until next time, fly safely and keep the blue side up.